image,
Sure.
or I can put it over there if you prefer.
It's the same difference. It doesn't matter really. So whatever you're happy with. Perfect.
There you go.
We'll get all that official stuff out of the way, and then she'll
Perfect.
set the tone, introduce you,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you take over.
Very good.
And then for the Q&A, I don't know if you just want to run the Q&A yourself in terms of taking questions.
Sure, I'll offer it
Um,
that they can ask while we go because after.
Good afternoon, folks. We're going to get going now. I just have a couple of housekeeping items. My name is Kathy Newhook with the Harris Center. So thank you guys all for coming out today. This afternoon's Synergy session, Kickstarting Innovation in Rural Communities, Stories from Ireland. Hopefully that's the session you think you're at. There's an emergency exit. Actually, it's right behind you, so you can't miss that one. Um, there are also emergency exits if you go and follow this hallway out here. The washrooms you'll also find down this hallway. We'll be recording today's session on live webcast. It'll also be archived on our website, and taking some photographs during the session as well. If that's an issue, let us know. It's also why I'm using the microphone. I don't need it in the room, but we do need it for anyone watching online. So keep that in mind. If you have a comment or a question during the session, um, just put up your hand. We'll get a mic to you, and then you can introduce yourself and ask your question, and continue as though things were normal and you weren't holding a microphone in your hand. Um, Also, just a reminder to turn off your cell phones or put them on silent. I'm going to turn things over to our partner for today's event, Nicole Helwig, and she's going to introduce our speaker.
So good afternoon and welcome everyone. So again, my name is Nicole Helwig and I head the Center for Social Enterprise at Memorial. Before we get started, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. On that note, I would then like to welcome you to this session, Kickstarting Innovation in Rural Communities, Stories from Ireland. A beautiful day, and thank you for coming and joining us. It's a pleasure to be hosting Dr. Felicity Kelleher, where she has been spending the better part of this month at the Faculty of Business Administration. Again, I'm with the Center for Social Enterprise, and with the Faculty of Business Administration, we've been very pleased to be her host. She is a visiting scholar from Ireland's Waterford Institute of Technology, and this afternoon she'll be sharing lessons learned from her work fostering innovation in social and commercial enterprises in rural Ireland, a place which has a lot of resonance with the rural communities in this province, both in terms of history and culture, also to a certain extent in terms of our environment. So she will share stories of growth and innovation and some details of an Irish government initiative in greater detail. But a little bit about Dr. Kelleher. She is here actually as a Dobbin Atlantic Scholar, and which is a scholarship program initiated to support the continued development of academic, artistic, cultural, and economic links between Atlantic Canada and Ireland. Her current research is about developing a rural social enterprise education and research framework focused on capturing cross country knowledge in pursuit of optimized social enterprise support structures and to embed social enterprise ethos in rural and regional communities. So I think with that, I'd like to invite Felicity to the floor and look forward to the presentation and the workshop that follows afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm okay. Yeah. They gave me a system here to talk to you without the mic. Thank you very much for hosting me here today, and hopefully we'll be able to share some knowledge of each other's worlds and some stories of each other's worlds. Please do feel free to ask questions as we move through. I've tried to understand and comprehend as much as an outsider can the Newfoundland landscape in terms of policy and the engagement with federal and provincial governments. So forgive me if I talk about government from our perspective. We're not that different to you, really. So we're an independent country In Ireland, we're a republic since 1932, but in context, we're members of the European Union. So we do have certain rules and regulations around rural enterprise and around rural community development at national level, but also at local level. From our point of view, we call them regions. And then from a European level, we also have a certain amount of regulation and access to funding from the European Union. So we look at those as well in the context of what that can mean for rural communities. And maybe some of the ideas that are here. We've an established Department of Rural and Community Development in Ireland, and I know that you have a new role in terms of Canada, specifically targeting rural communities as an equivalent of a department. And some of the things that we're doing are further down the track because we've had that infrastructure there longer. And as you've questions, please feel free to ask about those particular policies and those particular criteria that we use in terms of engagement, because from that, maybe there are things that can be suggested, kindly suggested to your own policymakers and to your own department. So with no further ado, just in terms of my own background, why am I interested in rural community development? Well, I'm from a very rural part of Ireland in the southwest corner, Kerry. It's primarily dependent on Indigenous industry. There wasn't much international industry there. So while foreign direct investment has been very helpful for the development of Ireland, it didn't quite reach Kerry. And in my own context, I'm 7th generation of a family business. So in context, for us as we move through the 1800s and into the 1900s in electrification, and what came with that, we had to come up with innovations ourselves in that organization. And from there, we were able to comprehend what we needed to do to keep going and to do more than keep going and to more than survive. So you had a kind of a resilience and context. So before we start, I thought I'd ask you what you want from today. So what do you think?
I'm really interested in what some of the challenges.
1 second.
I'm interested in particular in what some of the particular challenges or barriers to rural development have been in Ireland, how you overcame those, and what sort of parallels you might see with Newfoundland and Labrador.
Great, and we're going to cover quite a bit of that, but also the opportunities that were foreseen by those on the ground. So a bottom-up approach to opportunity recognition and the development of those programs that came from the floor. And what I mean by the floor came from the communities themselves. So there's a balance between both. And while the challenges are there, I've tried to balance them, not rose-tinted glasses, but sometimes you can always look at a glass that's half full and decide if it's half full or half empty. So in our context, we're also looking at that. What are the droplets in those communities that are sufficient to let them do it for themselves? So it's really important to keeping that balance in context as well. Any others? Okay. So a little bit about rural Ireland. It's interesting actually in context. So this is a photo of the west coast of Ireland because these walls are traditional to Ireland. I don't know if you've seen photos like this before. As you can see, some of those buildings are very old and some of them are unoccupied and others are very new and obviously occupied and built more recently. So it shows that balance that you talk about in terms of the challenges of depopulation and the opportunities of repopulation, although we would prefer that these buildings also be rejuvenated so that the link between old and new is retained in the rural setting. In context, some of the things that are challenges for ourselves echo Newfoundland directly. So one of the challenges that we face is broadband access for all citizens. And I've been all around the Avalon Peninsula, and I guarantee you face the same challenges once you get down towards St. Mary's, etc., that you have the same criteria. What we are doing in that context is looking at a broadband strategic plan for rural Ireland, and that plan is being implemented over the last 5 years. it's making good progress, but the traction in the last 10 to 15% of the country, which is fine unless you live in the last 10 to 15% of the country, as you well know, is we're having certain difficulties by being an island in the middle of the Atlantic. So you probably recognize the similarity there yourselves, because there's certain interference that's created by both wind and water that is the same for ourselves and yourselves. So what we are looking at in the context of this is how do we help rural communities work together without interfering with the ethos of the community development from their perspective. So it's a real balancing act for higher education institutes across the world to ensure that that balance is retained. So some of the things we're looking at in community networks is how do we find the balance between engagement and isolation? And I say a balance because full engagement may not suit every citizen. Some citizens are there for a specific reason, to get away from the rest of us. So we are really conscious of that, because what that can create, if we say we're expecting full engagement, it can create its own level of isolation for those who don't wish to be involved at that level. These are really useful members of the community because they tend to have an outside-inside view. So they're still very valuable participants in what we're trying to create in community development. And we're very conscious of these linking people. So they're a link between the inner core of that community and the outside world. They'll often bring information from their other networks and help us develop our community with individuals who have knowledge but are not so immersed that they can't see the wood for the trees. I always think of that Mintzberg phrase, when they're in a jungle and they're cutting the way and they're trying to find their way in the particular environment, and somebody climbs a tall tree and realize they're in the wrong jungle. Now that can always and often happen in communities, particularly in rural contexts, where the boundary of the community is so strong that they're not taking the advice and the resource from beyond the walls of that community. So these individuals can be really helpful in terms of what we call social capital. But it's that idea. This is also true, the difference, or there's little difference between the Irish and Newfoundlanders, is we trade on our social capital all the time. So a sense of humor in Ireland is a tradable commodity, and it seems to be the same in Newfoundland. In fact, in Ireland, if you don't have a sense of humor, we consider it a form of disability. So you are looking for these bartering skills and ways of trading services so that the provision on the ground is such amongst the community that they're able to retain a sense of social enterprise without necessarily having to have the commercial means for every single product and service. And that's a part of what we're doing in terms of the context of our community network work. The last one is, what about collective influence? How influential are rural communities in Newfoundland? What's your perspective? Are they as influential as their urban counterparts? And yet they're half the population. So it's quite similar in Ireland. It's about 42% of our population is urban dwelling, but our influence isn't 42%. And it's partly because the collective influence of the urban dwellers is higher than our collective influence. So the other thing that we're trying to achieve is connectivity between these communities, so their voice is strong as a collective when looking to policy or looking to your central department. So these are two of the big areas of collective influence, and I thought they might be useful to you. I'll provide all the links through Kathy and through Nicole to all of these facilities from an Irish lens, and if they're useful, please feel free then to contact myself or the ladies in the context of what might be useful to transfer. The first one is the Irish Rural Network. Now, this was established as an aspect of the Department of Rural and Community Development, but is really helpful because people can go to that network as a resource. So I'm a member, and I'm a commodity really on that list, where they see me and they see my skills and they decide if I'm useful in a particular context. always nice to be loved, isn't it? So in context, what you're doing there is that you're providing a repository of intellectual resource through a computerized means that allows us to engage fully with our higher education institutes, with our support infrastructures, with our entrepreneurs and enterprise specialists who may provide mentoring support. And in context, we're also providing where they are based and whether they're willing to travel. So you're now in a situation where there's similar kind of access that our urban dwellers take for granted amongst our rural dwellers in terms of expertise and intellectual support. The other is the national link, sorry. So that the National Rural Network and the Irish Rural Link, IRL, because that's what we're recognized with internationally as a code. Even if you fly to Ireland, you'll see IRL at the start of the flight details. So the Irish Rural Link is a little different. This is a true social enterprise and developed since 1991 and has significant membership at 25,000 members. But more importantly, it has 600 individual community networks engaging with the Irish Rural Link. Now, this one was established by that community and is managed by that community. They engage with the National Rural Network, but the Irish Rural Link as a community is a not-for-profit, as we'd say, or a social enterprise in context. Any questions about those before we move on? Okay. And then in terms of the social enterprise and what we're working with in terms of social entrepreneurs, we're looking at how they can share and bundle resources so that there is availability of the mandatory or absolutely necessary resources in that community. That could be a hub, the hub value in terms of an enterprise space. And we're setting up throughout the country, they're setting up hotbeds in terms of those hubs so that there's digital access. It's twofold. We have an increasing population of digital workers or remote workers, and it offers them the opportunity to engage with humans intermittently. Now, not all of them wish to, but those that do, they have that opportunity to come into the villages and towns. We're calling them digital towns or smart towns and smart villages. And you'll see the Smart Village campaign that has gained real traction in the Irish context, that is creating this enticement for those who may have left at an earlier age to come back because of the quality of life and the lack of traffic, for example, and the affordable housing, which is no longer affordable to the vast majority of people if you wish to centre in Dublin. But it's also offering that context of saying this is feasible. It's not without its challenges, because I've mentioned broadband, but a lot of these hubs are creating boosters. So they're putting literally a hardware on the top. You know this stuff more than I do, but they're putting the hardware on the top of these enterprise centers or hubs that facilitates a booster system that gives them business level access. And as I mentioned there, the Irish Rural Network and the 600 community groups with combined membership of 25,000 created for and on behalf, by, for and on behalf of those communities. So why are we doing all this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. I know I have had the opportunity to have a proper look at Newfoundland in terms of your population demographics. We have a slightly different challenge to yourselves in that we're quite a rapidly growing population, but for two reasons. One is that the Irish have filled the earth and conquer it literally. The diaspora is about 80 million people. But up until 15, 20 years ago, our inclination was to emigrate. There's a phrase at home, we breed to export. So in context, this is a very new thing for us, is that we have net immigration into the country each year, which is rapidly growing our population. In 1970, we had less than 3 million people. We're now close to 5 million people. And by 2040, we'll be an extra 1 million people living in the country. Now, there are real challenges affiliated to that, but also opportunities, particularly for our rural communities. If we go back to the fact that 42% of Irish people live in rural areas, and the fact that Dublin is already creaking at the seams in terms of how many people can feasibly be fitted there in terms of accommodation and health and schooling, then the opportunity for the rural communities is quite high. So our key aspect of our National Development Plan 2040, which is worth looking at because they have very specific actions within the National Development Plan that maybe, if useful, can be converted from your perspective because your own Department of Rural Development is currently developing their National Action Plan. And I find when they have to write those is the perfect time to contact them in terms of your potential to influence its contents. But from this come some of the actions we'll look at in context. But their core goal is to regenerate rural Ireland by promoting environmentally sustainable growth patterns. And they've looked at this through regional gateways. So in context, what we're trying to do for rural Ireland is to ensure that there's a balance maintained in that 1 million people, recognizing that approximately half will end up in the urban sprawls. We're looking at the other half, how they can be embedded in the existing communities without losing the current soul of the community. So there is a challenge and an opportunity in context. Yeah. Oh yeah. So the question is, can I give a feel for the broad sense of demographics in rural versus urban Ireland? So about 42% are in rural Ireland. The demographics are roughly the same in terms of the proportion of that community that are under the age of 18 in both communities, proportionate to the total population. But what we notice is that there's a hollowing out of individuals living in rural communities between the age of 18 and 30. So what we're conscious of in a lot of our development plans is that while we've no expectation that all will stay, there is opportunities, particularly for higher education institutes, to ensure that some have the opportunity to stay and to not only join international firms, but have the support structures necessary to build their own businesses. So we recognize the balance between foreign direct investment and Indigenous industry, and we've actually split it into two support groups at government level. So those that are growth oriented and that are likely to export quickly as a new business is the IDA, Irish Development Authority. Those that are Indigenous firms that will likely grow, but not to that level and not to that high potential startup criteria, are facilitated under Enterprise Ireland. So we have a balance there in context. But there is certainly conscious effort to entice those who've perhaps been educated and have had experience either elsewhere in the country or most likely abroad as well. We have several diaspora schemes in place to encourage these people back into their original communities with certain amount of success in terms of traction. So you're seeing that show up on the ground. What it's really doing is taking that hollowing effect, and while it's unlikely you're going to alleviate it in totality because people want to spread their wings, we'd like them to fly back in the winter. So, okay. So I've mentioned the Department of Rural and Community Development, and I've mentioned Project Ireland 2040 as a strategic intent. So some of the specific things that we're doing in the Irish context will give you a feel for what things can and are taking traction and what things we tried and didn't work. So please feel free to ask questions as we work through. In the context of what we're doing currently, we have a 1 billion fund for rural regeneration and development to be implemented between 2019 and 2027, with the specific intent to invest in villages and outlying areas. Now, there's a real reason behind this, is that we recognize the need for physical regeneration to encourage people back into the hearts of villages and towns. We've hollowed out our villages and towns, similar to what happened in the US, by building the shopping estates, what do you call them, the malls. I was trying to look for your word, but by building the malls outside of the town centre. So a lot of this village rejuvenation program is about refurbishing the physical buildings. If they're non-rescuable, so if they're beyond refurbishment, we're looking at the paint the wall scheme. You'll see it in Waterford's walls, if you wanted to look it up online in imagery, where we're getting local artists to paint the derelict buildings with murals. And it has taken really great traction. And there's a festival around it each year now. So anyone interested in tourism, it can really engage people while they're transitioning through the rejuvenation process. Okay, and then at European level, there's the Rural Development Plan 2014-2020. That's 100, I better not put a point in billions, but 161 billion for the entirety of the European Union. We're quite tiny in terms of the European Union. As I've mentioned, we're 4.8 million people, and we're a little rock on the edge of Europe. So we're realistic about what contribution there is from there. But some of that 1 billion being invested is being matched by the European Union. I know I've spoken to several of you about match funding here. We have a similar process. While we have some control over what funds we put in to our own capacity as a country, that is often dictated by our economic well-being. Okay, so the ebbs and flows of such rejuvenation depends on the context of the particular year and how we're doing economically. There's the European Network for Rural Development, LEADER. Have you come across the LEADER program before? That one's interesting because it's on the ground. So we have LEADER representatives pretty much in every county in Ireland, and that's emulated across Europe. And these are individuals who have expertise in funding mechanisms that can give support to the rural communities in terms of applying for and implementing that funded development pot. It's a little bit like the extension programs that may have existed in the past, except they're being facilitated at government level rather than higher education institutes. They have really strong traction in Ireland. If you said the word leader to any rural inhabitant, they would know what you're talking about. Okay, so they are the primary scope through which this is distributed. And they have very strong affiliation to our Department of Rural and Community Development. There's the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. I don't know how many, can I just see a show of hands, how many are interested in agriculture? Great. Men and women after my own heart. So I mentioned that I'm 7th generation business. We made animal feeds over nearly 200 years. So I know a great deal about how many stomachs a cow has and whether they do or don't like molasses-based food. So of course we're very interested, or I'm very interested in the agricultural development. But one of the challenges we face is the mergers and amalgamation of agri-farms for beef and dairy. But what's coming from that is a new push for artisan farmers and looking at it as agri-tourism. There's quite a bit of work done in terms of agri-tourism where individuals who do not have capacity to earn a full living on farming alone are looking at an agri-tourism mix to facilitate that bedrock and to give people the continued sense of why they visit Ireland. So tourism and agriculture work quite closely together because a lot of people visit Ireland because they want to see sheep and cows on the side of the road or on the road if you're from Kerry, which please don't beep at them because they have the right of way. I kid you not, it's the law. But in context, if we're going to try and retain that kind of perspective and that kind of close to land ethos, then we do need some kind of balance between high-end, efficiency-based farming and the artisan farmer at the end of the scale. So that's some of the support structures in place. I thought you might be interested, I know that you have this, Kathy, you have this slide deck for them, for the audience in soft copy. I apologize, this is probably quite small, is it? Certainly for eyes like mine, I haven't quite admitted that in the last 3 or 4 months, I'm extending my arm further to try and see what I'm looking at. Okay, so these are some of the initiatives in the Rejuvenation Fund. And again, if you've any questions, please just stop me. Because these, I'll drill through them, but it gives you a feel for the different initiatives. And I can stop and describe any of these initiatives if of value in the Newfoundland context. So the first is measures to encourage residential living or commercial development in town centres, including investing in vacant spaces. Now, this is proving quite helpful in the Irish context. One of the challenges is that these buildings need refurbishment. What you can do as part of this initiative is negotiate a public-private partnership, so a partnership between the individual enterprise or social enterprise and the public entity, the government department, or one of the support agencies to create that ethos and actually access to finance in terms of refurbishment. So you apply, and again, this is where Leader is really helpful. You apply for the funding, and there's access in 3 ways. So one is through microfunding, which has been negotiated with the commercial banks to give access to those who may not, under the normal commercial rules, have access to refurbishment funding in this case. The second is that it's a partnership, so it's matched funding. So if you, as a social enterprise, come up with X, that can be matched with an equivalent X by the government agency in the context. The third is if we have enterprise centres built by the Irish government with the ethos that which we build, they will come. These are less successful than 1 and 2. So it's kind of a smorgasbord. There is recognition that the IDA centres aren't filling in rural communities, whereas the other 2 are proving quite good in traction. So it's a lesson learned from the Irish context. Yourself and then yourself. So it depends on the context. Okay, so when we describe there the first in terms of the microenterprise, the capacity there is that it's a loan, but that the rate is not detrimental to the small business or small enterprise context. What has been happening in the past is that the rate charged is far higher than the normal rate, creating a barrier to finance. John?
Can I get you to take? Sorry. From now on, as you go to have questions, feel free to do it during the slides, but just raise your hand so I can get a mic first.
So I didn't see anything about political and social aspects of living in rural Ireland. Now, my background, I'm a United States citizen, and we have a cultural divide between the urban and the rural. So people who live in cities and think they might like to live in a rural area may move there and find themselves surrounded by Trump campaign signs and feel very much ostracized or isolated politically and socially. What is the climate like in rural Ireland?
Fine. And I appreciate your perspective, John. I did spend time in Missouri. I spent about 6 months in Missouri about 4 years ago, a little different to Ireland. I was asked a question actually by a colleague while here, what's the political landscape of rural Ireland? The 2 main parties are divided by a hair. It's nowhere near the divisiveness that exists in other countries. Actually, their only division in terms of policy is history. So there are historically 2 sides of when we became an independent country. But in terms of their policy, Fine Gael could be perceived of as being a little more on the middle class side, and Fianna Fáil could be perceived a small bit more on the social side. But we're a true social democracy. So that kind of a divide, in honesty, doesn't exist in the same way as somewhere like the US. Because in truth, we're a relatively small island. Remote for us is a couple of miles or kilometers, as you'd say. Um, Whereas remote for the States could be a couple of 100 miles. And in context, this idea of urban rural, because of the rural urban pull for youth, is that you, we always say at home, sure, when you scratch the surface of anyone, there's a bit of muck. And what you're really saying there is that we all have origins in rural Ireland. There's only a very small portion, even in Dublin, that are true Dubs. The vast majority are migrants in their own right that have moved there after the age of 18, 19. And in context, then, that affiliation to rural living is much closer than in other larger countries. And that's a lot to do with just size. But in political terms, take your pick. You can actually vote for either. And we mostly vote the way our fathers voted, our mothers. So in context. The concept of improving public spaces in towns and villages and the development of areas of buildings for community facilities, I thought it was really interesting since I came to Newfoundland how many post offices you have, because we do too. Now, the advantage of those is you can always post a letter if you need to. The disadvantage of them is that they became the community hub for many of these rural communities by default, which is, when we think about social enterprises, a mistake, because their goal is commercial rather than social. And as such, their sustainability is dictated by commercial well-being. Now, in our case, we've a huge tranche of them closing across the country. And there is a rhetoric that you'll see in the newspapers, or rural Ireland is closed, the post offices are closing rural Ireland. What we're trying to do here is to embed a far more social perspective on these central meeting places and meeting spaces. Where community halls exist, we're working with those that coordinate the community hall to ensure it's being used to its fullest capacity. And you have a question here? It's Nicole, just here.
Well, thank you. I wondered also in the previous slide about the different hubs. And now you mentioned the post offices. I wondered about libraries, if you have public library system.
We do, and that's what you're just ahead of me. And that's where we're basing a lot of our hub activity now, is in the libraries, the existing libraries as buildings. We're strongly recommending that in context, because these spaces can be used for a myriad of activities. And also, when you think about the individuals who may be in enterprises themselves in these hubs, there are opportunities for them to speak to the local community as well, to have open evenings in relation to the commercial activity or the cultural and arts activity in the community. And these are proving very successful in the context of really bedding in that space as their space. And the projects for entrepreneurship and innovation, which I'll look at in far more detail now, measures to tackle social disadvantage. One of the challenges we face, and it seems to be similar in Newfoundland, and apologies if I'm stepping on toes now, there's no way I'm an expert after 5 weeks. But in rural communities, there's a false perspective in the media that rural community equates to idyllic living. I don't know if that seems to be a little bit similar here. And, we know as rural dwellers that it's not exactly ideal to live in a rural community, particularly if you're not doing well. So the difficulty for a lot of rural dwellers is access to a sustainable income at a level where it's a comfortable living. So we're looking at that in the context of social disadvantage. We're seeing it in particular with our new citizens. So I mentioned net immigration. Our new citizens in Ireland are coming from all over the world. We have a large community. We have nearly 500,000 that are Eastern European. And as these engage and embed in communities, they're as likely to embed in rural communities as urban, because the urban environment is mostly a barrier to them because of the cost of accommodation. So in context, we're looking at that balancing act. in terms of a disadvantage, as simple as English classes in the local library. And that creates a hub of activity where people start to come and say, oh, tell me about your home country. And that, as something so small, can create a real social understanding of each other. And that barter system starts to take hold where they're saying, well, what do you do? And this is what I do. And why don't you come along to X? So it's small stuff is the big stuff in the context of that. How many are involved in tourism? Great. So we'll look at a couple of the specific stories around tourism. But of course, the vast majority of rural enterprise is micro in nature, so they have normally less than 10 employees from the European definition. I know the Canadian definition is 5 employees, but the vast majority of them that are non-agriculture in rural communities tend to be in the tourism space. So we work quite a lot with tourism enterprises individually, and then collectively as a source of sustainability through the social enterprise system as well. This idea of walking and cycling, I think I really enjoy your trails since I've been here. And Signal Hill is a false comfort because you go down first. And there's no train on the way back up. But these trails have become a real magnet for social and commercial enterprise in rural communities. And it has an ability to connect different rural communities like no other. So what we're using is the old derelict railway tracks, and we're developing greenways. So I'll talk to you about one of many greenways in Ireland, but the traction is vast. It's really incredible. And the rejuvenation that's been created in those little towns and villages and little enclaves along those paths is really interesting. One of the things we're doing to try and embed that is getting the local people, because some of you were speaking about Shanakees or storytellers, getting the local people to tell their stories and providing access to these audios as you walk the trail. So you are now in X. And that's created, these trails are 40 to 50 kilometers long. People are cycling and walking them. A lot of locals are doing so. And now we've signage, you know, have a cup of coffee, have a seat, that is creating the commercial aspects of a socioeconomic infrastructure around these trails. So we acknowledge the challenges. Any of you worry about Brexit here? We really do. Because we're a little rock on the side of a bigger rock on the side of Europe, and the bigger rock may leave Europe. So it has a really serious connotation for us. To go back to John's question on politics, it also has a serious cultural and political connotation for us, because we are a full island, but only 26 counties are part of the Republic and will remain with the European Union. The top right corner is part of the UK and will leave when Brexit occurs. We have a border that runs through farms, runs through farmhouses and homes, and runs through a mountain range in context. Us, although it was suggested to us by Trump recently that we build a wall, it is not feasible or desirable. So while we appreciate the economic challenges of Brexit, we also really appreciate the social challenges, because the North has come so far in terms of the peace process. We'd like that to be maintained and evolve into what it really can be as a community. I've mentioned the post offices and the broadband, and this is what you were asking. This is supposed to be that they're dropping the farming tools and moving to the city. We have the derelict, and this isn't an issue for ye, no? So we have the odd pothole. And if you're interested, on YouTube, just look up Irish pothole swim, and you'll see a young lad going for a wee swim. It's that big a pothole that he has found. We know these challenges exist, but we also have made real progress with the 2040 plan. And again, these are individual policies or the individual action plans that are sitting in the context of the rural community and can hopefully give an idea of what we're hoping to achieve. So the Regional Action Plan for Jobs was to generate jobs outside of the enclave of Dublin and the commuter belt. We've done quite well there because we've increased it by nearly 150,000 jobs, which is ahead of target. Now, the specifics of this are in the 2040 plan, and the link is with the ladies. But if you have any specific questions on that, feel free to come back and forth to me. And if I don't know, there are people that do, so we'll put you in touch with them. The Town and Village Renewal Scheme, I thought this one was particularly valuable in the context of some of what I've seen as I travelled around. I've done, certainly very close to all of the peninsula, the Avalon Peninsula, in both directions, in all directions. And what was noticeable in these was that the benefits of village renewal would be very high in some of these communities. So these are small projects, and you can see a listing of the various projects, and you can tap into each of those individually. But there's 500 odd projects in situ now, and you're seeing the traction almost immediately. I mentioned the Waterford Walls as one example. Small capital projects and small capital grants, microfunding, or pure grant aid, depending on the dynamics of that area. Social inclusion and community activation program has very good traction since it started in 2018. You've 1,300 projects approved through the LEADER program. So I mentioned leaders in every county. So we have 26 counties in Ireland split over 3 regions and split over 4 provinces. That's the way we work it. And those social inclusion and community activation programs are specifically seeking to ensure inclusion of young people who can feel quite isolated in rural communities. Is that emulated here? So we have challenges with their mental health if there are too few. Much older people can be quite isolated as well, so we're looking at the community activation programs there. Our new citizens in the same context. The Community Facilities Fund, this is directly in the area of social enterprise. 3.7 million has been allocated for volunteer centres and information centres. John.
So I'm looking at the bullet point about volunteer centers and information services, and you were talking earlier about one of the challenges being access to uh, business knowledge and understanding. And so we at Memorial and the Faculty of Business, we're in the business of turning out people, young people, who have business skills and understanding, who are looking for jobs, and many of whom are uninterested in working for the corporate man. And I wonder if Ireland has experimented with, or what you think the prospects would be for funding um, something like an outreach or extension service providing young, relatively recent business school graduates with salaries to sit in these rural areas and be support for community and social enterprises that have a clear social mission and not maybe so much in the way of business and entrepreneurial understanding.
I think it's a really good idea, and I think that the plantation taught me a lot while I was here in Kitty Biddy, because we are very supportive of high potential startups with the New Frontiers program, which is embedded in each of the regional higher education institutes, but goes out and facilitates the early development of these businesses. We don't have the same support structures for the arts and culture, for example, which often are the lifeblood of small rural communities, certainly. So the balance is required, and it's some of what I'm bringing back. I work quite closely with some of the departmental and sport agencies in terms of what you're bringing back from other places, and it is one that we'll be bringing back. I think that's a very good idea. I think that in context, what we do in the colleges is while they are students we're encouraging our students, although under the entrepreneurship stream, but we are encouraging our students to directly engage with the rural communities with the intent of embedding them in their own communities with micro and macro projects. So micro projects, an individual working with a social enterprise, and macro projects then where a collective of these students, through including the tutelage of their supervisor, are embedding these projects in these communities. The hope therein is that they'll stay after graduation. But I think there's great value in having a shoulder system of that nature, facilitating their further embeddedness after graduation in context. Okay, I've kind of given you an idea details of a lot of these already, and the Greenway I'll come back to. But the Waterford Greenway, there was a lot of barriers to its embeddedness in the community, saying, "Oh, that'll never work." And we tried that before. I don't know if you hear these lines, but there is a lot of our work is around, I know we tried it before, but things have changed. And culturally, things have really changed in Ireland in that it's really noticeable amongst those 40 and under how many are really interested in their health. Those of us 40 and over are trying to compensate for not being interested in our health earlier on. But as a result, you have this cultural bubble coming forward where things like the Greenway are really showing great traction very early. So 250,000 visitors in its first year of operation is massive. It went beyond what we anticipated. So there may be a value in re-looking at what we tried before through the current cultural lens of all countries, because there is definitely a movement there where people are much closer to the land than they have been. And there's a lot of movement around fork to, from ground to plate, or fork to plate as we call it. A lot of movement around GIY, growing it yourself. And these are generating opportunities for certainly social and commercial enterprise in rural communities. So it's an interesting one in context. So I gave you an idea of what we're dealing with in terms of population, and we need to put that million people somewhere. We're going to need room for them in terms of education and relook at lifelong learning because things are changing rapidly. I mentioned to a colleague while I was here this month that I have 11 nieces and nephews. There's only one in a job I recognize. So the rest are in things that, one is gaming and they give him a salary. There's another in nanotechnology. I could tell you what he does, but I don't understand it. So there's multiples of these jobs that are coming through hard and fast. I think that the opportunities for lifelong learning amongst our rural dwellers, and for those that we conceive of as elderly that have plenty yet to give. A relook at those that are over 65 in our context, retirees, is of benefit to the rural communities, because there's nothing more valuable to their mental and physical health than being active. So we're looking at that in context as to how to engage that, and there's a number of initiatives in and around that as well. So how did we get there? Okay. So what does innovation mean to you? What does that word mean? Imagination? Risk-taking? Creativity, yeah, absolutely. What does it produce? Great. So what we're really looking at here, when we think about innovation and the stories I'm about to tell you, we're thinking about it in the context of, well, how do we generate that imaginative, risk-taking, creativity? How do we nurture that creativity to find those new ways of doing things? And we're really thinking about that in the context of, how do you create, how do you change, how do you experiment in context in order to transform the way we're doing things? So taking on board how much change there is in relation to our occupations of the future. You know that there are 70% of the roles that are being done today didn't exist in their current form 20 years ago globally. So Facebook, Twitter, Google is only 20 years old, the great source of all things. So in 20 years' time, we're also trying to visualize in the context of this, what is it we're trying to create in these communities that's future-proofing the community as well in terms of that innovation. I just thought it might be useful to think about what types of innovation there is, because we can become a little bit focused on what's our deliverable in a tangible way. Whereas the types of innovation that we've really seen drive all those new roles is technology. We have business innovation, but also social innovation in the context of entrepreneurship. Marketing may be an innovation that's really helpful for rural businesses, even if the individual enterprise, whether social or commercial, doesn't have a website, for example. But there's where the social enterprise can really get involved and offer them a page on the central website where you have a tapping system into the rural community, and they've access to the outside world without the cost and fear of engaging fully in the technology. And back to John's point, there's where technicians can be trained or retrained, and young or old, or less young, in the context of what can be done in those communities that can really help bed that in. There is product, of course, that's innovation all the time, but what we're really noticing, particularly with engagement in rural communities, if you're looking for someone to spend money in that community, is we're becoming more and more experience-led. And the ethos of nothing left but our footprints is becoming more and more embedded in the mindset of the upcoming generations. They are far more conscious than we have been about the production of product waste. So if we're thinking that way, what can we do for our rural communities to help embed that ethos in that community to provide the income necessary for sustainability? So we're looking at that in context as well. So one thing that we can do for people is the business model innovation. So we can look at the things that can really embed in those individuals the ethos or the capabilities necessary to continuously improve. You know, it's back to that old adage, feed a person for a day, or give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, show them how to fish, you feed them for life. We're really trying to do that with these rural communities. We've made huge mistakes early on in these programs. The Innovation Voucher program is one such scheme in Ireland, where we facilitate embedded intellectual prowess from the higher education institutes into these organizations and into these communities through a €5,000 voucher provided through Enterprise Ireland, where you co-create a plan for the implementation of capability development or the implementation of innovation. But that really should be owned by the organization owner. And we made the mistake originally, and it's 20 years that we've been at this, but we made the mistake originally of setting out the plan of campaign for individuals, which creates a helplessness that's really unhelpful to the wider community, because it takes away their power of creativity and imagination and risk-taking. And it decreases their skills to do those things in the future. So if we're talking about renaissance and resilience, we've to help them develop their skills in context. And that's the purpose behind business modeling. So this is the innovation voucher. I've mentioned to you it's worth €5,000 to each of the companies. If it's a commercial entity, they pay the tax. They pay the tax on this, which is 22%. So they have €1,100 that they pay, and on that basis, they have availability of several hundred hours of our time in the research centres. There are specific skills there on innovation under all 5 of those on the disc. So depending on what they require, we take those on board in context. Have you any questions around this? Because I know that I've been asked about the innovation voucher scheme in context. It's available to all organizations, specifically to those of smaller size. So while I say it's available to all, it's available to all SMEs. It's available to smaller organizations. It's not available to large entities or multinational corporations. It's particularly helpful in small firms, so with less than 50 employees. So we've been conscious to transfer knowledge and innovation in this way in terms of this innovation voucher scheme between higher education, business, and research and technology. The first time that we've tied those very strongly together in the European Horizon 2020. And it's the first time that we've tied those very strongly together in Ireland through the Innovation Voucher Scheme. The challenge for the academics is we have to learn a new language that doesn't have a whole load of ologies in it. So as my dear old dad used to say, if you can't spell marmalade, say jam. And in context, the challenge is also to appreciate that blue sky may not always work, and that change is not a blue sky activity in resource-constrained communities like rural communities. So we're very conscious that it's an incremental gain. And it really helps to embed it if you can see a very fast win. So a part of what we're doing is ensuring that whatever we're working with them on is being implemented really quickly. Because of course, you all know this. Businesses and rural communities and individuals that are on the knife edge are all short-term oriented because they have to be in order to ensure that they have the income necessary to sustain their livelihoods. So in context, what we're trying to do there is to ensure that it's in bite-sized chunks and that it's something that they immediately take ownership of. So we're very consciously stepping into the background and we're offering advice rather than direction. And that takes a certain amount of re-education of ourselves, but also of the community, because they've been used to a system of being pre-established and preset. And you're unlearning past experience, which is the hardest thing to do. Any of you had to teach someone how to drive recently? Any? No? It's very different to driving. So if any of you have it in the future, hire someone else for the sake of your family. So this is kind of where we are. Just, I didn't know if everyone knew where Ireland is. I don't ever make that assumption. And this is where our institute is and who we're servicing in terms of 5,000,000, or sorry, 500,000 people. So we're roughly the size of Newfoundland's population, that corner, that region, the southeast region of Ireland. We're 4.78 million people now, so it's moving rapidly. And this is what we do, complex, but it really gives a feel for, we're up around 350 innovation projects now, but it gives a feel for all the things that we do. We're tapping into 800 academics. We've 40 in resident in the research group, but we're tapping into 800 odd because depending on the particular specialism, we have access to all others in the context of expertise. And what we're really trying to do there is to build in service innovation into all three aspects of what we're doing in context. So we're looking at the academic research program, but in particular the applied research program with projects that affect people like yourselves. And that's what I focused on from here. What we use is design-based thinking. So many of you have come across that before. I see a few nodding. And it's a good tool of boundary to know when to shut up and let them talk, and when to ensure that we've got the baseline to feed out into the community. These are some of the things that we look at in terms of imagining the rules that don't exist yet. So we're really quite conscious of the three words that were used there, of imagination, of creativity, and of willingness to take risks. So we're doing that ethos of it's okay to fail, because there's a lot of people in these rural communities that are terrified of failure. So one of the first things that we're doing is saying it's okay, fail early and fail often. That's okay. Actually, a lot of the products and services we use today were accidental. Everything from Teflon pots to Post-it notes. They were not intentional. Somebody made a mistake and look what happened. There's also this idea of risk-taking, the flip side of that, to embrace ambiguity. And we're really working quite closely with these to really try and embed this kind of ambiguity so that it's okay that we don't have everything on the page on day one. And again, that's helping people to comprehend their own skill set, because a lot of the time in rural communities, we're finding people are far more capable than they realize if we just give them a chance to shine. And an aspect of that is building in that collaboration that we've talked about already. The last piece there is this idea of visualization. It can be really daunting to get a big old computer printout and say, fill that in, and you might have access to funding. So a lot of the time when we're working with them, we keep the form filling to type A's like myself that like it in multicolors. And we're really working with them on a culture of prototyping. We're really looking there to release all of their ideas. Invariably, they teach us more than we could possibly teach them. So you're looking at that balancing act all the time in terms of the ideas. They're simply mocked up. So we'll mock up the ideas, say, okay, how might this work? And then we throw it to the floor. We might swap them around with the team so that they don't get too used to who they're working with. And over that period, we really discuss the insights and findings with others as well. If the voice is very strongly, oh, we tried that before, or that won't work, we ask the 5 whys. Why won't it work? And when we get to the 5th or 6th, no, break that down again. You start to get the nugget of idea from the problem they state. So often it's as strong to get the nugget from that won't work as here's my idea. So, sorry, we do get them to make choices. And that kind of encourages the idea of experiment as well. And we get them to make those choices later in the process. So we don't push for the choice too early, so that there is that kind of context of saying, okay, let's leave this as a second choice. So if there's a 1 and 2, we leave 1 and 2, and then we say, how is this an extension to 1 when we get to there? And then integration, how do we collaborate to get those ideas moving? We're very conscious to get integration beyond one organization or beyond one enterprise, because in rural communities, we know for definite the survival of a single entity that does not collaborate is unlikely. So we do need them collaborating in rural communities. They're just too small to do it alone. And that's really what we're quite focused on at the latter end of this. So what we give is 160 hours over 3 months, 2 days immersion and 3 days in-depth meetings. And we co-design, develop and implement an innovation. We analyze the program outcomes with the owner manager or the community, depending on who we're working with. Okay, I've spoken to this. So these are, as a kind of, we have about 20 minutes now, and I just wanted to talk through some of these and hopefully, business model innovation. My fault. So we basically, just to walk through it from a chronological perspective in terms of design, we explore to understand their perspectives and try and loosen all questions. We're used to asking questions. I always say, as a action researcher, I'm both nosy and interfering. So in context, you're really looking for their perspective all the time. We're looking to converge to a point for the right question. That could take several days to get from point A to point B, and then to generate the potential solutions to whatever problem or opportunity they come up with. We're converging on that solution to visualize how we'll be able to implement it, and then looking at the roadmap and implementation in terms of empowerment for themselves. We keep in touch with them as well. It's a lot. It's not light lifting if you're engaging and facilitating in this way. Like most things, it's nearly easier do it yourself, but that is not what we're there for. And in context, what you're conscious of is empowering the individuals whom themselves can become champions in their local communities. So I have a couple of them here. I tried to do a cross section that were very different in their ways. So I give you an idea of what the project is, and then I show of hands if you're interested in it, and we can move to some of the other. Any questions so far? Is there anything you expected to see that you haven't? Okay. So Celtic is a business in a rural community in Ireland. It's just outside of Waterford. And they had a challenge of scaling profitability. They're a metal manufacturing subcontractor. What they do is that specialist paint that goes on big trucks and caterpillars and that kind of thing. They were in survival mode. They were a small indigenous business, and they weren't competing well with the wider FDI supported or multinational community. We're operating in a hyper-competitive cost-based pricing industry. This is to give you an example of organizations that exist in rural Ireland across the boards that are still in the product space. They needed to realign their strategy, and they weren't very clear on strategic intent. At the time, they had about 40 employees from memory, and in context, they were looking to regain competitive advantage in the marketplace. They needed business transformation really to convert to sustainable profitability. So this is how we worked with them. And again, this is available to you online, and you can expand it in context. But we looked at all of the layers in context in terms of diagnosing, reframing, strategizing, implementing, and offering them belief that this plan will work in terms of their own implementation. So some of the things we did was identify the key stakeholders. What customers should they be retaining, for example? So we did take an activity-based costing view on this particular organization and said, okay, 80% of your customers are only providing 20% of your revenue, the classic 80-20 rule. So we looked to diminish that number of customers and to focus on the customers that were high revenue generation. And in context, some of the things that we did in regards to lower down in the system was process optimization and marketing in terms of digital marketing, which they didn't have in place. Also, in terms of learning and development, we did quite a bit of training on them on design and prototyping so that they weren't reproducing or reinventing the wheel every time they had the potential to gain access to a new client. So we got them to put prototypes in place. So they weren't using all of their really valuable resource in terms of their people on reproducing something that they could have on the shelf. In terms of business readiness, we set criteria of measures that could be reviewed on an ongoing basis, which was new to them. So in context, these were some of the things that we did as a holistic view in regards to their work. At all these points, this was their doing. So while we sat and facilitated and gathered and came back to them with saying, this appears to be what we discussed in terms of summary, we never took ownership of any of these tasks. They were always with the organization themselves. And the outcome was that they rebranded as a contract manufacturer outsourcing partner, which has created an increase in their revenue of 33%, and they've doubled their employment base. Now, the benefit of that to the rural community is substantial. They've hired people from that community they serve. They're in international markets, and their job creation from 100 to 150 employees is growing now. So they started at down around 40, 50, and now they're in this space. They also did partner matching, which was cost-based pricing structure versus value-based pricing structure. So we looked at which customers might be strategic with them, and it was those that they chased. So that gives you a feel for how you can do this in terms of embedding innovation in rural communities at an individual company level. Questions?
Should just yell into your mic. You said you didn't take ownership of the process. So any troubles as you go through these programs with different companies to get them to actually go through the process?
Yeah, absolutely. Shouldn't it be no fun otherwise, would it? I think that the challenge was on both sides of that fence. So the challenge was that if their experience in the past was just tell us what to do, we to loosen that from their side. But the experience of a lot of my colleagues and myself included in the past has been tell them what to do. So we to loosen that on our side as well. So we tended to have an observer in place intermittently with all the projects that facilitated a loosening of the bias on both sides of the fence. And that person was an honest John or an honest Joanne. So that was an individual who helped to loosen that. But yeah, certainly. And we had the one thing that you need in a process like this is honesty on both sides of the fence. So we checked in regularly on both sides, and they checked in regularly with us as to whether it fits their needs and whether we felt it was fulfilling the ethos of a design-based thinking approach.
So your last slide was fairly comprehensive in terms of the work you're going to go through with that particular company. Just out of curiosity, do you remember how long it took to get from the top left corner to the results that you
In
showed on the
terms of
next slide?
their implementation, about 18 months to the initial uplift to 100, and then about another 12 months to 50. But it's controlled growth. We don't physically implement, they do. They check in with us on a regular basis once the plan is in place. I would say that was really beneficial. I don't think we've any business implementing in organizations once they get to that point of a comprehensive plan. There's real benefit in them taking ownership at that stage in its totality. So yeah, and I don't want it to appear, I think we tend to write these things like Cinderella, and then they lived happily ever after. But, there is a bit of stickiness in the game. There is a benefit in me coming from a small business background. I don't deny that ever. It was a business that was known. So there were individuals who felt a trust in me just by my affiliation to that business that I may not have had if I didn't have that background. So I think that there is a capacity there to remember in rural communities. I'm a member of a rural community then, and I've moved to a different one, but I'm now a blow-in. What's your phrase for blow-in? I'm now a come from away because I'm 3 counties over. But my accent is sufficiently different in the current community for them to know I'm not a local. So there is pluses and minuses of that, and we're really conscious when we're working with and training our own team about the realities of that. So there is a huge language barrier if someone goes in and is too academic. There's another language barrier if somebody goes in and doesn't comprehend the language of transparent research and transparent implementation. So we really are strong on ethics. There's a consciousness of how much we can share between the projects, because we're conscious not to give away someone else's intellectual property. So there's all these kind of dynamics that exist in these projects that have pluses and minuses as we work forward. Okay. I thought this one is really truly a social enterprise. This is an enterprise park with a difference. It was established by members of this small community, very rural, well, from our point of view. It's about 15 miles from Waterford, but right in the hub of rural community. It was established in 2000, and they're a social enterprise with the mission to cultivate an entrepreneurship culture and facilitate job creation. Now, what they've achieved here is quite impressive. They have units, so a little bit like the plantation, actually. They have units available to organizations that are what we call lifestyle organizations or lifestyle entrepreneurs. But there's also capacity for mentoring and business supports with links into the college, into the Waterford Institute of Technology. And there's a connectivity in terms of environmental certification as well. So the sustainability word is being used in mutual tone there. Because it is built for and by the community, it's truly embedded in the community ethos. And they've recently written a book with case studies of their experiences as social enterprises, which is available. One of the things that they had recently, which shows the link with Europe, is the citizens' dialogue. So we have a citizens' dialogue, a roaming dialogue with Europe that comes to Ireland to speak to that funding infrastructure in the European space. And they had this event out in Dunhill outside, because it was one of the 7 days per year that looked like that. And but in real terms, that gave them the opportunity to have 100 people in their environment and showing their community ethos. So there are two ends of the scale. One is a small production facility fighting for survival and how we can help them in context in terms of innovation embeddedness, and the other being innovation embeddedness at a community level. Any queries about this one? Yeah, happy enough? So just one more then. Perfect. This is one that was global, just Ireland. But in context, this Voucher Ireland is our representative board for the whole of the tourism sector in Ireland that is responsible for training and development of tourism operators. It is different to Tourism Ireland, whose purpose is to exhibit Ireland abroad. So, you know, when they turn, I don't know, Niagara Falls green and you know, the Coliseum this year green, that program turning the world green for St. Patrick's Day is through Tourism Ireland. This program is for development of tourism operators. Tourism is a huge industry in Ireland. We had 11 million visitors last year, up from 7.2 million visitors in 2010. It's a vastly growing engagement. One reason for that growth has been the branding of whole regions. So if you have a look at Wild Atlantic Way and the Ancient East, it is those two that are primarily responsible for that uplift in visitor numbers. There's real potential here for that. The Wild Atlantic Way is bringing a whole new tourist to our shores, exactly the kind of tourist we want, because Dublin is full in terms of tourism. So it's bringing people over to the West Coast. And that journey, which is a trail all the way from the bottom, from Cork all the way up to Donegal, is offering people access to rural Ireland who still has latent capacity for tourism in all those communities. So one of the things that we did in Voucher Ireland was looked at innovation in terms of network facilitation, knowledge sharing, and capacity development. Now in this one, we worked with 600 regional and rural tourism firms over a 5-year period in terms of embedding skills affiliate to their sector in those small firms. And these are primarily rural operators. That's very small, so I apologize for that. But in knowledge sharing, we looked at exchange barriers between them. We consciously mixed individuals from different communities and identified the champions in each community that continue to engage with each other up to this date. And the other is the exchange benefits, was to exhibit the real exchange benefits to them over that period of time. These were events that were held, and then we had an online fora that we worked with them and brought expertise online in context. Now that was twofold in its reasoning. When this was embedded in the early 2008 to 2012, 13, was really the influx of online booking. And they were being absolutely slaughtered by those who had skills in online. So by affiliating the slow engagement with technology, this allowed them also to then engage with some of the innovation voucher schemes to facilitate that embeddedness of the technology in their own workplace. So there was a lot of, you know, cross-pollination of the things that could be done between departments as well. So this is what we looked at in collective, was competency development, collective experience, information release and resource exchange, and a learning set. We established a certification program for the tourism operators. Many of them, it was the first time they'd qualified in anything in higher education. And it offered an opportunity for those who wish to continue to enter a blended program on a BSc in small business management. These are some of the things they had to say in terms of traction. And And this is some of what we're looking at now. So we're conscious of the risk of formal broker dependency. What we mean by that in English, sorry, this is the scientific bit. What we mean by that in English is if we became the center pillar of this, it would fall away when we fell away, and that's a known fact. So we were really conscious of that, and we tried to ensure that the academic support structures were a facilitation role that slipped away quietly. The risk of broker dependency we were also conscious of. So we started to identify the high potential people in the community and tried to break up too strong a broker, too strong a champion, because they will invariably do one of two things. They'll either become stressed by it all being on their shoulders, or they'll alienate the peripheral members of the community to the detriment of development. So we're looking at a balancing act there, and it's been relatively successful in terms of the evolving learning community, in terms of learner autonomy, that they still have access to all of these support agencies. But we also have a mentor support structure, a mentor apprentice support structure between those that are very good in some communities and they come to the other communities and speak to them. So you're speaking peer on peer as well. That's it. That's the Waterford Greenway. I live back there, down by you. But that gives you an idea of some of the things. It's just connected thinking. And it's worth looking at this one and the Mayo Greenway, because it really, your trails are incredible here. And there's real potential to, leverage it in a different way. It costs about 15 million, but with 250,000 visitors in the first year alone, it's a huge magnet for visitors in the region. And we've seen rejuvenation of no less than 11 little villages along that route. It won a variety of prizes, so we worked with them on the feasibility study. So, oh great, it's exactly 3 o'clock. I'll ask you if there's any takeaways that you've had today. I know that's like trying to take a drink from a hose, hearing that much in an hour and a half, but any thoughts?
So I'm a social worker and a researcher. So I'm trying to look confident because I know I'm in a crowd that's probably not. So it's a whole new language for me in lots of ways. But there've been, so I see where there's many places of intersection. So I look at how can we build capacity in communities to enable people to age and die in place. Hence my question about the demographics. So there's many places where we intersect, but where we digress, I think, is around the outcomes. So I understand that the kind of community capacity building that you're talking about here around sustainability is a goal that will benefit people and enable people to age and die in place as a secondary outcome. But I'm really interested in how to make it a primary outcome. So how do we make that those social goals a primary outcome? Is that even realistic, or will we always be a sort of ancillary kind of benefit?
No, I think there's real potential there for it to be a primary outcome. And I think they're doing great work in Ireland in that context. The community health, I'll get you the exact details of it. So there's another social enterprise in Ireland, the community health infrastructure. And an aspect of that is to ensure that it's a primary outcome. Another is comprehending active retirees and the potential for them to truly contribute. So the active retiree network in Ireland, again, a social enterprise, but one that's really embedded in their communities as well. The local media has a part to play. I think podcasts are a really valuable tool in the context of rural Ireland. And the reality is that we should be hearing more of that demographic on our local media and in our local radio stations too, so that we're hearing individuals who look and sound like us. And I think that those will help with social cohesion and social inclusion. There's several technology options that are being embedded in the Irish context. GrandPad is one of them, which gives elderly access through technology at a pace and level that is suitable for their capacity. Many of them aren't digital natives, some of them don't have access, but these are the things that can create that kind of impetus. And those outcomes are quite tangible. We can see, we have markers of mental and physical health that can show us progress being made through these interventions. I'm not in the health environment, obviously, but in the context, there's a great deal being done, and I'll provide the details, and Kathy and Nicole can pass them on. There's surely a couple of nuggets there of what's happening elsewhere. Germany in particular is very strong in this area. So and the Scandinavian countries, they really know what they're doing there. So I'd encourage you to look to the Scandinavian programs as well. Any others?
Across all the different projects, and I know there's loads of others, does anything factor in elements of affordable daycare, childcare?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually some of the social enterprises are really strong in that area in terms, and the barter system I mentioned, in several of the rural communities that have really come very far, they've done a kind of a parent-based bus system, which facilitates through their collaboration, some of them to have Mondays and some of them to have Tuesdays to run the centres. Have a look at Rural Bus Ireland, and it's just called Rural Bus. I'm just saying Ireland because of where I am. That scheme and other social enterprise is a really strong scheme, and they collect people to. And this goes back to the elderly point. I know this sounds mad, but they collect people to go for their pint at 6 o'clock, and they bring them home at 7:30. But I'm really glad they're there because I'm hoping they'll do that for me shortly. So these sound like small things, but they're massively important on the ground. Any other? Great. I think I've taken enough of your time. Hopefully there's some things that you can, it's hard, one size fits no one. So, but I really appreciate your time. And I'll just leave you with this thought. The next time you're passing through rural Newfoundland, stop and have a coffee, will you? Thank you very much. So we'll have a look at the workshop, and hopefully, you know, it's great that it's a small number of us actually, to be honest, because then as you've queries and as you work through it, feel free to ask any questions that are pertinent to your worlds. And I'll pair you up in terms of getting into the space where hopefully you'll have takeaways that are specific to your environment. So when you asked about health, so I'm going to go back to two questions first. When you asked about health in the community. Oh, lovely. I'm a pacer, so it's good for the Fitbit. So you asked about health in communities. So one of the challenges in the Irish context is an increasing waistband. So in terms of the obesity epidemic, really, in Europe, but in particular, Ireland is looking more, we say, when Boston sneezes, Ireland catches cold. So our obesity epidemic is accelerated even in comparison to Europe. So some of the things that we're doing at community level, which is really important in that context, is we do things like walk to run, and these are all being coordinated by the social enterprises in those communities. They've a 5K challenge, a 5-kilometer challenge. They have, we have GIY HQ in Waterford that's worth looking at. So two things it does that is really helpful in the context of health in our rural communities. One is it encourages those in the economic disadvantaged areas, both rural and urban, to get the kids early in growing their own product and produce in the old allotment system. So we're re-embedding that in the context, and that can be done anywhere. But it is a way, it's a nucleus that's health orientated in rural communities that brings people together on Saturdays and Sundays or any day of the week. But the kids find that they have ownership and their comprehension of consumption of vegetables and I don't know how much fruit do you get to grow here. I'm assuming you have rhubarb. because that's like a staple diet at home. You must be like us, similar land. Um, what it's doing there is embedding a comprehension of healthy eating, but also a comprehension of sustainable consumption amongst the younger community as well. So there's one that would also allow simultaneously engage cross-generational engagement, because what we can do and what I've thought about as, at the coffee break was you can pair an older with a younger person in terms of the older person showing them the skills they learned as a child themselves. And it's really useful in terms of embedding in communities when you look at the design-based thinking of transferring the old skills. But we've more and more people, if we flip the coin to tourism, we've more and more people now coming into our communities looking for an authentic experience. And now we have a capacity to show them the authenticity of everything from thatching a roof. So we have thatched roofs in Ireland. I don't know if you know that. That's a reed-based roof in Ireland. It's traditional. To whitewashing the walls, to growing the vegetables and what is seasonal. But the health benefits are astronomical. You can embed in the ethos of a child between the ages of 6 and 15 healthy eating. You're giving them a skill for life. If we don't embed that by the time they're 12 to 15, we've lost them because their inclination is hiding the sugar from their own kids in due course. So these are some of the tools that we're using. So that's GIYHQ. I'll get the specific name for you in terms of the community health care group as well, because they're embedded in the community. One of the others is Jigsaw, which I sent you on the details of, another social enterprise, and it's specifically related to youth mental health. Now that's right out in the communities and particularly vibrant in the rural communities. And it's called jigsaw.ie, and you can see the details of it there. So these are genuine systems of self-help in the communities. So you were asking me about residual memory. So we weren't an independent country up until 100 years ago. We were 800 years as part of the UK. And as an ex-colony, you know, there will be that residual memory, okay? The bad old days or the good old days, neither of which existed except in people's minds' perception. So in terms of the bad old days, you'll have people say, oh, when Waterford Crystal closed in Waterford. Yes, it was a huge pull. You had 1,000 odd people working for very large salaries that were now immediately in a situation where those weren't particularly transferable skills. But that being said, the potential for Waterford was there as well. So you're looking at engagement in being two parts. One, how to break up residual memory. So when we talked about the 5 whys, you're looking at the 5 whys with people to try and loosen their perspective as well. And conversationally, I know that a few of you asked me that. Conversationally, that's a skill you develop. I would not be sending out a newbie to do that role of loosening people's perspective as their first job. That's for the people that have experience engaging with communities. But I'd be highly encouraging them to be the observer. And you say to them for the first week or month or whatever it takes, you're here to watch, but you have to have 5 questions for me at the end of the session. So if you think about it, what you're really doing is getting them to retell their story through different lenses. And you've seen this with the 7 perspectives. You wear different hats. So you say, okay, be the antagonist in that story if they're too rose tinted. Be the rose tinted in that story if they're too antagonist. Right, you are responsible for resourcing that story. What would have made the difference? If they use the word they, you can loosen that. So you're stepping through the different perspectives, and I can provide you with these tools if you are the facilitator in this. But you're stepping through these different perspectives to loosen people up, to recognize 2 things. It was neither bad, nor as bad nor as good as it first appeared. And in our mind's memory, we're inclined to be either hero or victim in our own stories. So you want to loosen both hero and victim in these, and to find the common ground of where We're just people. Yes, we were part of it. It's not what it used to be, but look at what potential there is. So one of the things I say is that had it stayed the same, I'd still be looking for Newfoundland because I've no sense of direction. So some of the tools have made my life incredibly, vastly more easy. I've saved more than a year in being able to press a GPS button. Even on my phone, it brings you there on foot or by car. These are tangible developments. So if people are stuck in what used to be, you can say to them, well, do you have a mobile phone, access to Google? Whatever it is that you feel is modern technology you can see they're engaging with daily. Can you imagine life without it? Now you're in the space where they're using your word, they're using their imagination. So that's the way that we'd start them on the journey of imagination. Then we'd say, how would you use that now to make the difference in this community, the creativity? And then are you willing to take the risk? So you're really working with them, but it takes weeks. If they're really hardened in that perspective, it takes certainly 4 weeks to 2 months to loosen them. But on short visits, treat it like a doctor's office. And you're allowed to complain for 5 minutes with me, but I'd nearly put an egg timer on you. And that's just socially. Exactly, exactly. So, but in honesty, right, shoot away, but I'm shutting you down after. And it depends on, I mean, my relationship with people is different, and I get away with saying I'm shutting you down after 5 minutes. Apparently, if you smile, it softens it. So I learned that early. But it depends on your own temperament. You're not, authenticity for us is really important, in the community. And, whether you're a community champion or a facilitator or a government worker or an academic, I don't know what that means. But whatever our role is, we'll individually spot an unauthentic person. So really what we're looking for here is authenticity. So the tools remain the same, but the implementation of those tools we own. And I'm very different in my approach to my colleagues, but we follow the same rough plan. Had you any other questions from earlier?
Question is, twice now you mentioned observer. And the first time you mentioned observers, I had a different perception, but it was my interpretation, I'm sure. And this time you've talked about it, somebody new learning the ropes. Whereas when you used it before, my head immediately went to the concept of an observer who can help with the evaluation process.
They're two different roles with the same word. So yes, there's no wonder I created confusion. So in one, we're looking at the master apprentice model where we have the respect for the community you're serving. So give them the best potential to succeed. And if we're sending out juniors that aren't experienced in the process, we're diminishing the best potential to succeed there. So in that case, we're training the new individuals. And in that case, we're treating the observer role as a training facilitation role. In the case where we have those interim observers, we're absolutely a version of observation police. Because we get into bad habits, don't we? It's like retraining people in driving, to go back to that analogy. That observer is there to say, now both hands on the wheel. and you're drifting here and you're putting your own biases into the scheme. And we try and move ourselves, myself included. It's part of the reason I'm here. If you're in an environment too long, you've two choices: change the environment, which I don't want to do. I like working for the organization I work for. So the alternative is to change my location intermittently to learn new things. And we all have that perspective. So I think you're looking at individuals who decide, no, I'm not doing it that way. We're going through that same loosening process with our own colleagues. And myself at times. The observers can come back and they're pretty tough, because we're tough on each other when we observe. We don't filter it. So there's no Cinderellas, I'm afraid. Any other questions? You happy enough? I think we'll look at this. It's very much a workshop environment, and it's just to show you how we might embed this through this process. it's best if you have a thought as to a particular problem or opportunity in your own work, because then you can work through it and you'll go home with some work done, which I find for myself is always a good way. Alternatively, if you can't think of something, I'll suggest things based on your particular occupations. I would like to pair you. It's okay if you're in the same organization or whatever. So you decide yourselves who you want to pair up with, but it just means that you can test it in the reframing over the next hour or so. But what we're doing here is we're walking through the process so that the bits that are of use to you in practice, you take home. And the bits that aren't, you remodel this as you see fit. Although, if you're taking out a step, it's best to ask the 5 whys of yourself. So why am I taking out that step on exploration? Oh, I know it all. Do I really? So, you're asking the questions around why you're formulating it in the way you're formulating it. It is meant as a flexible tool. There are people that spoke of design-based thinking earlier, but it's pushing us out of the problem-based learning approach in practice. It goes back to a question you asked, which is short-termism in small businesses and in rural communities, because it's fire pole territory, as I call it. So you're in the domain where you're saying, I just need to get through today because I'm crisis managing. Now, the difficulty is if we stay in crisis management, that's not future oriented at all. And it actually shuts down the vast majority of our brain power, because we're probably in the front bit of our brain, which is fight, fright, or flight, if we're in that crisis mode. So a part of this is to loosen people out of the crisis mode and say, while it mightn't feel urgent, what's vitally important to your organization is to strategize in order for a portion of your time and effort to look to the future, because the future is tomorrow. It's upon you. So in that context, what this is really doing is looking at the potential to loosen present and future perspectives to rebalance what's important for that organization's sustainability. And that's a slow burn with some of the individuals if their natural inclination is, I must fix it. Because as I always say of Shackleton was attracted to crisis, so he created his own problems. I know they got off Elephant Island, but I'd rather have been on the boat with Amiston from day one, who was a planner, because he didn't go through any crisis and he came home all in one piece. Now, what was interesting there is that the Shackleton was more successful in the story. So we can be attracted to two things. We can be attracted to story, and there's very few from rural Ireland, and I suspect it's the same in rural Newfoundland, that don't love a no good old story. And there's one thing, story doesn't lose in the telling. So individuals can be very attracted to storytelling, which can be detrimental to long-term planning because they can't tell the story straight away of how they rescued the day. So again, we're trying to loosen people from victim and hero perspectives, including myself at times. Oh, I rode in on a white horse, so maybe I shouldn't do that. So you're trying to loosen that in the context of this short-term, long-term balance as well. So these are the steps that we work through, and hopefully they'll work through the same for yourselves, is to understand the perspectives in terms of exploration, converging to a point of view and reframing, to ideate, visualize, and empower. So if we look at it step by step, so I'm hoping that you're starting to visualize, if you could, a problem or opportunity in your own work or your own environment. Okay, something small, it doesn't have to be big, something small that's occurring to you. What is it that you say, I wonder if I gotten that email? It can be as small as that today. In that context, what we're trying to do is to formulate a proper or a complete vision of the problem or idea. So we're really working towards framing it in a complete way rather than driving into the actual solution really quickly that we think is the right one. If you go back and think about decision making, we are supposed to search for all the alternatives to come up with the best alternative for the current situation. But it's our natural inclination to go back to the old tried and tested methods. And the difficulty is what was old and tried and tested isn't going to create the solution for the future. So we're really looking for something that's innovative or creative in terms of your terminology, willing to take a bit of a risk to ensure that we're future-proofing the organization or the enterprise. So the goal is to learn about what assumptions we made. So if you think about what you thought today was going to be and what it actually is, I'm assuming it's different. I'm also assuming there's 12 or 14 of us in the room. I'm assuming there's 15 versions of what happened today in the room, each of yours and somewhere close to the truth. So in the context, we're looking at those assumptions we've made. So have you thought about what kind of assumptions would you make about Ireland? How many of you met Irish, direct line Irish before? A good few of you. So you've all met Irish before. And the assumptions of the Irish are what? What baseline assumptions do you have for the Irish? Just like you. Okay. Does everyone feel that? Give or take? Okay. Any other things about the Irish? What is it that makes you think that they're just, we are just like you? And vice versa. Down to earth, great. So you have baseline there. Hmm? Yeah, yeah. Food and elixirs are particularly important to the Irish. Yes, absolutely. And I've noticed to the Newfoundlanders as well. Why do we search for that kind of commonality? Exactly. And if we talk about community, it's one of the first ways. If you meet someone in Ireland, they're fishing immediately. And Justin, you were fishing immediately. Oh, I have a friend from down that way, a part of Ireland. Do you know her? And we do exactly the same thing. But what you're actually doing there is that you're making assumptions about people based on your comprehension of who they are, where they're from. And we're building a picture, a total picture often of what their skill set is, for example. So we're trying to loosen those assumptions. Who do you think you're not like? Who, is there nationalities you think, okay, they're very different to the Newfoundlanders? Any? Americans, okay. And we would say we'd say something similar about our next door neighbors as well. So, you have it's called psychic distance. So even though we're very close and we sound a little bit, well, we all speak English-ish. So in context, there should be the same similarity between all of these communities, and yet there is distance. And I know I have the wisdom to know a Canadian is not an American, and I'm hoping you have the wisdom to know an Irish person isn't English. So in context, we have these triggers that creates assumptions about others to say, oh, we're very different. But actually, if we peel it back, there's probably more similarities and more differences between all of those four communities than we acknowledge. So that's why we're trying to loosen that, because that's where the creativity lies. Is okay, well, what if we were very similar? What if we were very different? What is the difference there? And what can we create that facilitates that in context? You come across root cause analysis before? So we sometimes think we have the cause when we only have the symptom. So she sneezed. That's the cause of the cold versus the virus that gave her the cold. So we're really looking for the virus in terms of root cause analysis in our assessment or in our drill into the community challenge or opportunity. We're looking for the baseline. And that's where the thinking comes from in terms of drilling all the time, and how do we propel the way that curiosity as an instant perspective. So the minute I meet people now, I can't help it. I'm curious. So tell me about yourself, as opposed to all the assumptions that are going on, and hearing people's lives and understanding that we've namesakes in households. Kathy has two daughters that have the same names as myself and one of my sisters, so I won't forget that. So you have those baselines in terms of root cause analysis that you're searching for as well. How do we know that? How do we know the correct problem or opportunity to innovate? What are the things we can do there? It's a harder one, isn't it? our inclination, again, back to the way our brains work, and this we know is consistent regardless of whether you're from Kerry or St. John's or from Colorado or wherever, is that we'll go to the problem we've seen before. So we're trying to loosen our brains as facilitators and their brains as community leaders, our community, rural community members and stakeholders, trying to loosen that brain set to say, is that really the problem we want to address here, or the solution, or the opportunity we want to address here? But is that balancing act with the way our brains naturally work? So we're pushing our brains a bit. When you come out of these facilitation sessions, I guarantee you, if you're doing it right, you'll be tired. Or knackered, as they say at home, but that's just very tired. Okay. So I'll ask you to do this. Everyone has a story. Designed for them, you need to collect their stories. So why I'd like to pair you up, if you don't mind, is just tell the story as briefly, as succinctly as you can. So we'll give you 2 minutes to each coin. And it's the other person that will give the succinct view of what the problem or opportunity is, not you. So you have to express that in a way that the other person can articulate it. When you hear it back, decide whether it is what you intended or not. Okay, so that's what we're searching for in this. And we're exploring the problem by learning from and gaining insights of the audience. So this is what we're trying to achieve. So if you'd like to stand up and pick out who you'd like to sit with, and if ye speak to anything, it does not matter what the challenge or opportunity is. All we're doing is expressing a way of walking through this. If you could speak to that really succinctly as to what is the thing you'd like to either implement in terms of an opportunity, or what's the problem you'd like to fix. I'm pointing out that this is in terms of the modeling and context. Okay, so you all have a feel for each other's challenges, and what we're just going to walk through, and I'm focused on ensuring that you come out of here with something of value. What we're doing now with that is that we're going to drill into it relatively quickly from the point of view of the next half hour or so, but you're taking away tools of engagement. I was asked a very good question by Justin and Kathy there. Is this modeling, are we loyal to this modeling? Only to the extent that it's useful. And I have a healthy disrespect for all models, even those I've created myself, because it's only when it's useful. So we have to trust our intuition that we have a lot of emotional intelligence, and we have a lot of knowledge around working with these communities. So these tools should be used and abused as you see fit. And in context, I'd say the same of any other tool that we use in the context of our work, because the tail should never wag the dog. And if we start following these loyally, we're in the domain of that occurring. So it's only the steps that are useful there. But hopefully you gain something from hearing your idea back and going, I could clean that down a bit maybe on certain ones. And next time you give them a little clip if they talk too much and you get a chance. So in context, you're balancing the odds in relation to getting to the drill. One thing that we were trying to do here as well was to listen to all voices. So we have 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 1 mouth. It's a 4-to-1 average. And really we're looking for that in the context of, if we don't have all voices, particularly if you're trying to source, in your case, you're trying to source a broker, a central person, a champion. It's sometimes the quieter individual who's quietly engaging the whole of the community that you're searching for, not necessarily the loudest voice. So in context, we're quite curious about what the complementary skills are in the context of the communities we serve. So we're not the client, we're not the community. We don't want to jump to solutions for them because it reinforces helplessness. And again, an old phrase, a wiser man than we once said that the problem with the Irish is we still have our hands out since the famine. So you have a kind of a historic residual that can be there if you've been contributed to without some kind of quid pro quo or reciprocal contribution that has created this thing of will be given. So we're trying to loosen that in the context of this. We'll collectively create is what the principle is on the underbelly of this. we do tend to jump to solutions because we think we know. It's always good to know what we don't know, you know, the Jarvis window. So we're looking for that in context. Now, I know I've said here 10 minutes, but what we would do here in context so that you have the tool to build out this over the coming week, ideally, is to think about, okay, you've described your idea, you've done this. Who's experiencing this problem? So that's when I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes just on your own sheet. It's your problem now that you're working off. Who is the recipient of this problem? Who is really feeling it? And if there's a lot of them, who's the one that you want to target first and describe them so that you have a pace towards action? You're taking the problem or opportunity that you've just described and you've a pace towards action into the community you wish to serve. Give you 2 minutes on that. Yep, it can indeed. The world can revolve around the individual that's implementing it. And if it is yourself, then this is a self-help tool, and in the true meaning of the word. Okay. Another minute, are you okay? What's your sense of that question? Did it easily identify the individual? What are the blockers for you if you're having trouble? You don't have to answer me. I'm just saying. First step. Yeah. Sorry, I meant to get the speaker there, but the difficulty if you stay at aggregate level of the whole community is they remain an elephant. And not in a bad way, I like elephants. But the breakdown of short wins is about breaking down to tangible interactions that create the momentum into the community. So in the case of, sorry, what was your first name? In the case of Richard, if you're looking for within an entire community who the potential leader of the community can be in terms of a local champion, you are bedding yourself in and observing, but you'll see 2 or 3 people that will come to mind relatively quickly within an hour or two. Equally so, you'll be able to see the linchpin members of your community in the same way. And you know, you really are searching for the champions in the context of that kind of work. So it is that individual then who's experiencing the problem, are those cogs that are creating the motion within the community as a first step. And to find a central person and a peripheral person it simultaneously is quite good. So you can see their experience through 2 sets of eyes. And that way you're spanning the boundary of the community. So it's a helpful question because we are drilling down to an individual as a first step. And then they'll become a family of individuals. And if you go back and think about the whole principles of training the trainer, for example, you look for 5 who can train 5 more, who can train 5 more, and you're up at 500. Whereas if you try to train 500, nobody will hear you. So you're looking for your small number who'll train 5 more each. And the multiple comes up into the whole community really quickly. Okay, the last question on this one that's of particular interest in the context of what you're trying to achieve is what is the value of the idea? So it comes back to your question in relation to impact. What is the value of this idea? And if you can describe it to an intelligent but uninformed individual, so pick an elder that you can describe it to. What is the value to them as one of the stakeholders? And ask them, or describe it to them, and ask them what the value is. That's a very valuable first step in terms of comprehending what they're doing, because otherwise we're providing solutions to problems they don't have. And that's part of our work as a facilitator. Okay. Any questions on that one? So we drill it in that way, and the example I've given you there is people aren't recycling. You know, and I chatted to a very nice bin man today, or refuse man today, saying, what's the story with the recycling? Because I've left it out 2 weeks running. And it's apparently a different day. And I said, it's not on the sign that you gave for the fridge. Very type A, lots of highlighters. And he says, oh yeah, that's right. I am no wiser as to what day the recycling is. So the real problem is I forget or don't know the day of the week for recycling, and I'm confused by sorting recycling. So if that's the real problem, what way will we embed our solution? Very differently. They're not recycling, which is, you know, that stance that you talked about. Well, the other crowd are doing it. So we're already in combative mode, whereas this is, it's our fault because information is an issue and it's not articulated in the right way. And the sign on the fridge is useless. I'll put it into the recycling. So here is where we would use these kind of tools. And these are in your notes, and they're also available a soft copy. If there's any use, I don't know how you feel about templates. Some of us love them and some of us hate them. But it just gives you that drill down. And POV just means point of view. We just love acronyms, don't we? So the drill down of, can we describe the idea? Do we know who the person is that we're working with? What are the needs? What is the value? What is the problem or opportunity? You can drill it the same way. All right. So what are our assumptions around the problem that's happening? What you think is fact is likely to be an assumption. I often tell a story on this that sometimes helps me understand what the difference is between fact and assumption. I was told by my mother, and I believed her, that ladybirds get a spot every day they're alive, which I told my 6-year-old nephew when I was about 25. And he brought me out a book, and it was the first time he gave me that eye that says, you know nothing. They're apparently different breeds, but I made it to 25 believing quite firmly that that was the case. So we have a lot of assumptions like that. And it goes back to the connectivity or the similarity between ourselves, which of course is there. But the similarity between ourselves is we're um, predisposed to find the similarities because we've both been told they have Irish accents, which they do in St. Mary's, definitely. But you know, the accents in Ireland are dispersed, and you can have a variety of accents in Ireland as well. So, in context, if we're told there are similarities, we'll seek out the similarities on the horizon. But if you want risk taking, we're looking for the animal in the safari for risk taking. And if we're looking for imagination, we're thinking that animal is pink. So we are looking for what has not been thought about before, amongst others, which makes us loosen our assumptions. And the toughest solution of all, our assumption of all, is that won't work. Our brain does that really quickly, doesn't it? It's almost instant. That's great. Oh, that won't work. There's a line, I think it's in The Borstal Boy, Brendan Behan play, an Irish playwright. And it's the problem with the Irish. I'll have to clean it down because his language was choice. The problem with the Irish is they solve the world problems on a Friday night, but they're if they can remember on a Saturday morning. But what you're having here in assumptions is that you're trying to loosen out. That won't work. So, you know, maybe show it to very young people. You're in communities. You're looking for engagement with the young. I do try and tap into that those two brackets of 8 to 15 and 15 to 19 before we get them, because they're the ones that are coming up, and I'm trying to change the way I'm teaching to accommodate optimized learning of the ones that are coming up for the next round of changes to the way you're approaching learning, because we need to collate with their approach. So are there any assumptions? I'm going to give you the same couple of minutes. What are the assumptions you're making about what you've said is the outcome of this or the value of this? So you don't have to have a big long list, but there may be a lot of assumptions you're making here. And these are your boundaries. Okay. Many? Couple? Going to pick up the if we were using the template, because it's just helpful because people take it away, we'd be inclined to write these up. Have they changed anything in terms of your problem or opportunity? Okay, so that's what we mean by reframing. I went to town on all those fiddly bits on the slide there. Sorry about that. I obviously found a new toy on PowerPoint that day. So the reframing phase is far more important than we realize, because we're really getting into the hub of the challenge or opportunity now. So it doesn't matter how you use the tool and which pieces you take away, but that reframing has a role to play, because it loosens our own perspective. And the inclination that people are resting in the past can sometimes create a challenge in the context of resting in the past in our eyes as well. Maybe they aren't. So maybe it's the way we're phrasing the term. And if we get the terminology right, we can often find that we're loosening people into future orientation rather than past orientation. So, where do you see yourself in 5 years is a really simple line. It can really help to loosen people from past orientation. So it's a mode, I like that phrase, it's a mode of focus rather than flaring. So that phrase, flame mail. I have several older people that have been helping use computers, and they send me everything in capitals, and I'm saying to them, okay, well, that's fine with me, but that's shouting in etiquette. So you're helping them to comprehend the social elements of that as well. And that's that focus rather than flaring, because then they're wondering why they're not hearing back from them. So this is just when we drill it a few times, we get into the nuggets of what we're trying to achieve for the particular client or the particular community. And in the case that you described, you're really drilling into individuals, and equally so here, you're really just drilling into the individuals first, and then we're folding out there in the same principle. I've mentioned the 5 whys before, and we've done it quite a bit, but if it's helpful, I'm just going to give you a minute or two there, because I can see some of you are drilling through what you're achieving. So there, what we're asking is the why question. So the 5 times is the rule of thumb. We normally get down to why. If we go back to when you were a kid, any of you have more than 2 or 3 siblings? No, it's just, oh, great. We bonded over our position in our families a couple of weeks ago. So why did you do that? In the 5 rules of thumb, in particular, my mother was particularly skilled at that, because when you're dealing with 8, it's relatively difficult to find the culprit. And in context, what you're doing here is drilling into the root cause. Okay, so we're really into what is the baseline here. If you want to give a try at the why is this occurring? And just, when you say the first one, see if you can't break it down to a second why. Absolutely.
One of the things that occurs to me as I listen to telling what it was they were interested in, I had this feeling that it was outsiders trying to impose something, as opposed to coming from the bottom up. And that can be bad, it can be good, it can be neutral.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens if the group is decides it's going to do something, say the university wants to do something, or the college, or an individual organization, and they go off and they get a research grant or whatever, and the minute they hit the community, they discover they've got it all wrong.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe the community doesn't even want them there.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
like, how do we work around that?
So a couple of things. First of all, we accept we're wrong. And that accepting of being wrong is the first step in the symptom versus the cause. We then look creatively at what grant we've been given and how we can maximize the benefit if we actually speak and listen. So remember all voices. So the easiest step there, but it is reliant on our expectation and acceptance that we're all learning. It's a bad day you don't learn something new. That if that team that have gotten that research grant have capacity to understand they've gotten it wrong, they also have capacity to redesign the ideation. So there's a real potential there to flip it, flip the classroom or flip the project so that it is for and of the community. The ethos of any funding application is that it contributes to the community you intended. The contribution of how, as long as ethical, transparent, and fair to all involved parties, can be negotiated, and that's global. So it's a great one. We made genuine mistakes and continue to. But the one thing that I've learned over the years is there is absolutely there's no wrong in admitting you're wrong. And that's why we're very clear on fail early and fail often, and we mean everyone. Can't go in saying to the others and not to you.
Very often funders very violent.
Ah.
So, and do it more and more. In my world, we're being forced to say what our outcomes are going to be
Sure.
3 or 4 or 5
Sure,
years
sure,
down the road.
Yeah.
And the concept of learning as we go is, some funders are getting there, but the vast majority, you tell them at the beginning what your objectives are. My God, you better meet the objectives. And I have these discussions all the time with funders, particularly when it's longer term funding.
Yeah.
But how can you expect me now to tell you where I'm going to be 4 years from now? If you want me to fill in boxes, I
Sure.
can fill in the boxes,
Sure.
but I'm not going to do nearly as good a job as if I have room to maneuver.
Yeah, I think you take the room to maneuver. Look, there's nothing about what you've met of me in the last 3 hours that suggests I'm a rule keeper by default. But you take your own maneuvering room. What you can, and what we found in those cases, is if you can exhibit to that funder at the end game what the evolution was and why it has moved into this territory, I think they're all receptive. So yes, we can set markers in the sand, but that's like testing the weather for Friday week. And as you know, in Newfoundland, testing the weather at 9 o'clock this morning is certainly a principle in blue sky thinking. And you get it. So in context, yes, we can weather predict in these projects, but I think if you keep a record of the evolution and that it was a conscious decision to shift right or left, when you look at things like emergence strategy, there's nobody will object to that because it's a founded principle. And if, it is about making decisions that people will, when they reflect on the optimized approach to solution, that I don't tend to go in with, they'll never take that as an answer. I tend to go in with, these are the reasons why we made these changes at these pivot points. Here is the achievements made. This is the enhanced impact our move had. And I've never had one come back and say, give us back the money, which is, you may as well whistle for your dinner. So in context, I think the trust between you and funder is equidistant as the trust between us as people who seek funding and the communities we seek to serve. And you have the same kind of trust and evolution with the community. So why not have that same trust and evolution with the funder? I find they're receptive, but they're receptive if you show transparency at the pivot points of change. And actually, I bet you if you look at those impacts in black and white a couple of years hence, you've made the impacts are equivalent and you show equivalency on a table and they're happy. Just give them an extra column. This is the equivalency of outcome. And it seems to work. So, yeah. Okay. So I'm conscious that we just have a couple of minutes, but I just want to go to, I don't like that, redefine your hypothesis. I'm a qualitative researcher, I count nothing. But in terms of that, what I'm asking you to do is based on the project that based on the process that you followed now, have you changed any bit to the original problem? Have you refined it in a different way? Are you getting into the tangibility of that? Now we're in the space. After doing this a couple of times, you know, add an elixir of choice, the Irish Newfoundland way, and you know, have another look at it in the morning. And that gives you the potential to get into the problem itself. And again, if you like these in context. So now we're defining our point of view in terms of users' needs and surprising insights. Now, the reason that's useful, surprising insights can be anything that's to you. So maybe one of the insights is that the key recipient on day one is yourself. Because we often look beyond ourselves and saying, oh no, the solution is X, Y, Z. And then you realize, actually, I need new training. The guys were just asking me about what training I do. I try and do a new training certainly every 18 months. If I'm more than 18 months and haven't been trained by somebody different and sat and listened and experienced the role of a learner, that's a mistake if my role is to facilitate learning of others. So, you know, I'm always on the lookout for kind of innovative and new training and extra bits and listening to and saying, oh, what are you doing and what class are you giving and can I take part in that? So that's where I'd say surprising insights there. So what we're looking to do, and this is something you can't do until you go out into your community, but once you're satisfied with what you've drilled into, you're looking to ideate with your own stakeholders. So maybe we're filling those forms in without talking to the communities we're working with. That's exactly my point. And maybe we really should be in front of them before we fill in the form. And that's a blocker. And I would be very honest and say, academia, I'm trying to convince my own crowd to loosen a bit in their perspective that they're all knowing, wise sometimes. We are all knowing and wise sometimes. And getting out there into the communities. And that's why these innovation vouchers are co-created. So this is before we ever go for the funding. We go through this process with them as we're building out and considering the optimum application of that innovation voucher for them, not for us. You know, that's a mistake that we all make as facilitators at times. And no stereotypes of what works and what doesn't. Go back to the Irish and the Newfoundlanders being the same. Are you the same as all other Newfoundlanders? Do you affiliate to a subsection of Newfoundland? Do you have assumptions and preconceptions of other Newfoundlanders in other regions? So do we. And I'm from Kerry. We have sport called Gaelic or GA, Gaelic football, and hurling for people who don't play football, because Kerry is a football county. And we're affiliate to our county long after we leave. But if I'm in Kerry and I'm asked where am I from, I'm very specific. So we are around that stereotyping all the time. So it's one to loosen about all rural community. I don't like when I hear rural community. It depends on what distance they are from our urban enclaves. They have different problems depending on how close they are to urban enclaves. Sleeper towns are specific issues. Whereas truly remote, Donegal in Ireland, has a different issue to a little bit remote but sleeper town activity. And then how might we, you know, sharing our problem in context? What insights did you encounter? Now remember, 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. So when you speak to one person in the community you wish to contribute in the next week, what do you learn from them if you close your mouth and listen and look? And if you can find 2 or 3 things that you've learned that you didn't realize, add them to your assumption list. And that'll loosen it out even further. And the last one is to visualize. We try to draw pictures. We find actually in rural communities that a lot of people learn visually. Not a lot. There is disproportionately high number that learn visually amongst our rural communities in Ireland. And the mistake made is if they're not read right, they're being isolated or there are barriers to those forms. So if we get them to draw the picture, we'll convert it to words at times and make sure that we're converting their true vision for that community to help release the barriers that forms create, because forms only contributed to one learning type, which is read write. And there are 4 learning types. So we're only doing one of the 4. We're not dealing with kinestics, so people that like to, any of you like to dismantle things? How successful are you putting them back together? So that's, you know, that there's a whole community of people that's how they learn, like the tangibility of doing, and any of your creatives will be in that space. So your cultural guys, your artists are much more likely to be in that space. So this will help to get their true view rather than you superimposing your view as you both spoke about there. And it can be any picture you want. I'm suggesting you sketch your solution. This definitely is over the elixir of your choice because you'd be amazed what you come up with. And empowering there in the context of the success. Okay, that's it. I'm 5 minutes over, so apologies for that as the questions were. Hopefully of value. If there are takeaways that you wish to talk to me about, I'll be here anyhow. It's been a real pleasure meeting you. If there is anything I can do of value, please feel free to contact me, and I've my business cards there and all that kind of thing. Thank you very much, guys.
Just before we go, and also for those who are still there online, for anyone interested in watching or sharing the recording of today's session with colleagues who were unable to attend, or if you'd like to review it, it'll be posted on the Harris Center's website, and we'll send or the link will be sent out through the Harris Center's newsletter. I'd like to thank everybody from Harris Center and our summer students from Center for Social Enterprise, Samantha, who helped out today. Very big thank you to Felicity and the Dobbin Scholarship that made this possible. It's really been a pleasure spending time with you over this month, and thank you all for attending.